Okay, so we have 4 speakers and I will introduce each one of them very briefly before they start talking. First up is Professor Paul Ekins, who is the Professor in Energy and Environment at UCL Institute. He's a very well-known face with regards to energy research in the UK, and I'm sure a lot of you know him. He will be speaking, of course, on the title, which is Sustainable Energy Policy, Economic Growth for the Big Emerging Economies of the World. So without further ado, I'll introduce Paul. If I could hold questions until right at the end after all the presenters have spoken, then we can get through this and have an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to the organisers for asking me to talk about this extremely important subject. I'm going to start, as you might expect from some academics, to talk about some definitions, because this phrase sustainable economic growth is not an uncontroversial phrase. Indeed, there are a number of ecological economists who think that it's a contradiction in terms. And so I want to make it quite clear what I mean by it before moving on to see what the relevance of energy and economic policy to it might be. I have far more questions to answer than I have time to answer them in, so you must excuse me if I skate quite quickly over some of the detail and hope that we can cover some of that in discussion. What kind of growth? Can it be sustainable in theory? Where does it come from? Can it be sustainable in practice? And then move on to the energy policy implications, the implications for the big emerging economies, and then a few thoughts about what are the implications for everyone on continuing on an unsustainable growth trajectory. This is the main source of confusion, in my view, in the economic growth debate, is that the various parties don't make it clear what kind of growth they're talking about. So when you hear remarks that infinite growth in a finite system is impossible, and you do quite often hear remarks of that kind, what they mean is growth of the first kind, physical growth, mobilization of ever greater quantities of matter and energy. But that's not what economists care about. They don't care very much about matter and energy. Most of them don't bother to count it and wouldn't know how to count it if they were asked to. They're interested in economic growth, which is growth in the amounts of money in the economy as measured by GDP. And recently, of course, there have been doubts as to what the connection between that and the growth of human welfare is. So we've got these 3 obviously interrelated concepts, but quite different concepts. So when you hear about limits to growth, question number 1 is, what kind of growth are people talking about? Once we're clear about that, and this is a diagram from Hurley and Daly, which helps us to clarify it. It's a diagram of the biosphere. Quantities in this diagram are measured in physical terms, and Daly uses this to show that the rectangular box cannot expand indefinitely in a finite sphere, which physical scientists among you will not think is a great realization. But it is something which economists, until relatively recently, didn't give a great deal of thought to. Because for them, economic growth, of course, is money, and money is not represented by the size of any of those boxes or spheres. The key question is, what is the relationship between the mobilization of matter and energy by the money flows through the economy? And what we know is that that relationship is not constant. It changes over time depending on the physical flow that you're interested in, and for many physical flows, such as flows of sulfur emissions, it has declined dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years, even as economic growth has continued. So the key concept there is decoupling. Decoupling growth of money from growth of environmental impact. The question then emerges, well, here we're talking about this economic growth, and I'm talking now about growth of money. Where does it come from? How is it that we live in an economy where we expect money to continue to grow over time. This is a quite special sort of economy. It didn't happen throughout much of human existence, not least because money is a relatively recent invention. But capitalism is clearly good at this kind of growth because capitalism stimulates and incentivizes innovation. And innovation is the key concept. We find new ways of doing things that either turn non-resources into resources, so sand into semiconductors, or renewable energies into usable energies for human systems, or which are simply better ways of doing things, mobile phones as opposed to landlines, etc. There's no shortage of energy, there's no shortage of materials if we knew how to use them. The key issue is guiding the direction of innovation to achieve decoupling. And that, for me, is the policy problem behind sustainable economic growth. Can economies be sustainable, economic growth be sustainable in practice? In local terms, I've already said with regard to sulfur and a host of other water and air emissions, absolute decoupling has been achieved by practically all the advanced industrial economies, and the big emerging economies are now seeking to go down the same route. If we look at the global issues, which is where most of the current concerns are, with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, we've left it pretty late. In fact, some would say that the global community has decided that we've got to limit global warming to an average of 2 degrees centigrade just at the time when it's effectively impossible to achieve that. Had we started on that task 20 or 30 years ago, when the warning signs first became apparent, then it would have been a relatively easy task to achieve, because innovation would have been guided systematically in that direction, and a lot of carbon emissions that were emitted in that 20 and 30 years would not have been emitted, and the big emerging economies would now be going down a low-carbon growth path instead of busy exploiting the practically infinite quantities of hydrocarbons that remain in the Earth's crust. So there is a huge challenge here to reduce these emissions to the extent necessary. But the biosphere is very resilient. We don't know exactly how resilient, and we'd be as well not to push it absolutely to the testing limit. We know what to do in policy terms. We've had a lot of practice of experimentation over the last 10 or 20 years. And modelling suggests, and that's all we've really got to go on, that although these policies may reduce GDP growth, and that's obviously not good news in a world that is finding GDP growth at the moment rather difficult to come by, it will not halt it, because the costs involved are not large enough. This is another area in which there's very considerable uncertainty among economics as among everybody else. Just how big are these costs of mitigating climate change? Number of bullet points there that suggest that the costs need not be very great. They're really investments, and they contribute to GDP growth. Two of the speakers, or the speaker from General Electric, a major investor in these technologies, obviously is contributing to growth in that way. Considerable opportunity for zero-cost mitigation. Number of resource-efficient technologies are nearly available at low marginal costs over the huge investments in the system that are necessary anyway. Learning curve experience suggests that these costs will fall as the new technologies are deployed. Against that, you have the economic pessimists who believe that these are much more difficult issues than I've suggested, and that we're going to get a big hit on growth. But how big? This is a piece of meta-analysis that was done for the Stern Review. Every little dot there represents a model run of a certain amount of carbon mitigation along the horizontal axis against a cost in terms of GDP. And if you go upwards from naught, then you get a GDP gain from carbon mitigation. If you go downwards from naught, you get a GDP loss from carbon mitigation. Well, you can see the great majority of those dots would suggest that we could reduce carbon emissions by about 70% with some cost, but the cost is between about 1 and 3% of GDP. Now, that's an interesting number. What does it mean? Some people interpret that as meaning an absolute cost from where we are now, so we suddenly lose 1 to 3% of GDP, and we know that that would be very painful indeed. But what the cost of 1 to 3% of GDP sometime in the future means is illustrated by this diagram, which shows that in a growing economy, and an economy growing at, say, between 2 and 3% a year, which before the financial crisis is what the global economy was doing, a cost of 3% of GDP out in 2030 is actually a delaying by 1 year of reaching where we would otherwise get to 2030. We would reach that level of GDP in 2031, because that would be the catching up of the 3% of GDP that we've lost. So it means that we're only 77% richer in 2030 rather than 80% richer if we hadn't mitigated climate change. So that's what that 3% of GDP number means. Well, in order to achieve this, what do we need to do in terms of energy policy? Again, the Stern Review was very clear about that and went into quite a lot of detail, and as I've said, we've had a lot of practice at putting these policies into practice. First is carbon pricing. For as long as carbon emissions are free, it won't surprise anyone with any knowledge of economics at all that no one's going to try very hard not to emit them. But that will need to be supplemented by technology policy, because there's a huge literature on technology and innovation that explains why its technologies do not get implemented as fast as they might. And then there are other issues to do with behavior change that need to be addressed. Well, what are the implications for big emerging economies? They need to do the same as everybody else. They need not to invest in high carbon assets, which in a low carbon world, a huge danger of becoming stranded assets. And they need to invest in natural capital. They need to invest in low carbon energy sources. And this is the toughest thing of all. They need, as do we, to accept that the high consumption lifestyles pioneered by the US and so keenly followed by everybody else are simply unattainable for a 9 million person population, and aim for high human well-being at a fraction of the resource cost and environmental damage. And this is my last slide. What are the implications if we fail to do that? If we fail to put those policies in place, and if we fail to accept the implications of low-carbon lifestyles? Well, it's very interesting, because the numbers are now starting to come in, not hypothetical future numbers from models, but real numbers from the kinds of events that climate scientists have said will characterize climate change in the future. The difference is that they didn't think it would be happening yet. So, Thailand lost 9% of its GDP in the quarter of the floods in December, according to Bloomberg. The Russian fires in 2010 took 1% off Russian GDP. And we're currently living through the worst drought in the US, certainly since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which is said to have reduced the US harvest by between 20 and 30% in the Midwest, with all the implications that that has for food exports, and particularly the poor people in the world who are struggling to pay for food as it is, given that that is certain to result in a large price spike. That's the world we can look forward to if we fail to bite this bullet. It's coming much sooner than most of us feared. I thought it would be beyond my professional lifetime, which isn't so long in the future, but nevertheless, here it is. And of course, global warming is currently less than 1 degree globally, and we're currently on a 6 degree global warming path. So we better try to make some reality of sustainable economic growth before its full unsustainability hits us between the eyes. Thanks very much.